Hello, everybody. You are talking to a team of folks from Lumina Foundation for All Learning Counts, breaking through to create a post-secondary learning system for all Americans. This is a webinar overview of our recently released request for information, and we really appreciate your joining us today. We are going to be recording this webinar and posting it online at luminafoundation.org/all-learning-counts if you'd like to share that address with your colleagues. We'll also be recording a list of frequently asked questions and reporting that there as well. Chad, can you please hit the record button? Great. If you have questions in the course of this webinar, I'll invite you to please type them in the Q&A section of the webinar screen that you should see. This should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, we'll record all of the questions that we receive during the course of the webinar and incorporate them into the FAQ. We'll also try to address as many questions as possible during the webinar itself. One moment here while we do some technical. All right, I'm going to share my screen instead, and one moment. We're okay. Here we go. I hope everybody can see this. And now we can advance our slides. There are actually 5 folks present in the room today. Our Senior Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer, Danette Howard. You are talking right now with Haley Glover. I'm a Strategy Director. Amber Garrison-Duncan, also a Strategy Director. Chad Aaron, Strategy Officer. And Nicole McDonald, who's not pictured on this screen, also Strategy Officer. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Danette Howard, who will be providing a brief overview.
Thank you. I am excited to have all of you join us today, and I'd like to start by saying a little bit about the Lumina Foundation for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are. Lumina is a national foundation. We are located in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we have a single time-limited quantifiable goal that really dictates all of the work that we do here. And that goal is on your screen, and it is to increase the proportion of Americans with a high-quality post-secondary credential to 60% by the year 2025. That goal has become the nation's goal, and it drives all of our investments and activities here at Lumina. We're excited to launch this request for information today, which is designed to solicit your best thinking about how we can accelerate the recognition of all post-secondary level learning, specifically for adult learners. We think adults are key to meeting the nation's talent needs, and in fact, that we can't meet those needs without adult learners. And believe it or not, that in order to best support adult learning, we need to think differently about how our post-secondary system should work. Now, in terms of the current state of attainment, today, the attainment rate is 46.9% in the United States, meaning that close to 47% of adults hold a post-secondary credential that meets the definition that we just shared a moment ago. And that definition includes certificates and degrees, or in other words, that 46.9% includes adults who hold certificates and degrees. We also know that about 2% of the adult population, or about 3.3 million additional people, also hold an industry-recognized certification as their terminal credential. Attainment has increased by 9 percentage points since 2008, and that increase represents millions of new credentials. But unfortunately, despite that increase in credential attainment, we're not increasing attainment quickly enough to meet the 60% goal. We also know that in terms of the goal, attainment is not increasing quickly enough for our equity populations. That is for African Americans, American Indians, and for those who identify as Hispanic or Latino. This chart shows the growth in degree attainment from 2012 to 2016. Despite growth in enrollments for our equity populations, African Americans, Hispanics, and American Indians, we don't see the same level of growth in attainment for those groups. Lumina is fully committed to what we call our equity imperative. And as we explore and invest in more opportunities to improve attainment for the equity populations, we also understand that these investments must result in improvements for all learners of color. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Haley.
Thanks, Danette. So if you are not familiar, you should check out a report we call Stronger Nation. This is an annual opportunity that we release that charts post-secondary attainment across all populations. Now, across the top of the screen here, you see a charting of all of the populations adult populations by post-secondary attainment. Within the non-credentialed part of our population, we have about 90 million people. Interestingly, we, being the data people we are, went and charted this against all other industrialized nations. The population of uncredentialed adults in our country is actually larger than all but one full population of all the other industrialized nations. So we are talking about a whole nation of folks who need our services and need the system to reform to better serve them. We also know that within those 90 million people, there are a lot of folks who are struggling. We know that there are about 40 million employed who do not have a post-secondary credential or experience. We know, however, that there are many, 23 million about that are unemployed or have just dropped out of the workforce who lack a post-secondary credential or experience. The median income of this group is about $30,000 a year. Many of those folks are, of course, living underneath that threshold, which is poverty in almost every community in our nation. But we also know that we have about 27 million people who have started college but never finished. We have that, again, that 3.3 million folks with a terminal industry certification, and by that we mean an industry certification is the highest degree of post-secondary attainment that student has earned. And we also know that we have about 1.3 million folks in active duty military, as well as many millions more veterans. We also know that the equity implications when talking about our non-credentialed population are clear. If you see on this slide to the right, our white population is credentialed at a rate of about 44%, while only 25% of the combined population of Hispanic, African American, and American Indian populations are credentialed. And so we do recognize the equity implications of all of our efforts to credential our populations and need to know that you are committed as well. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amber.
Thanks, Haley. Hi, everyone. As Haley's just outlined, we know that adults are gaining post-secondary learning through their involvement in work. Many of them are connected to the military or even connected to workforce training organizations or other community-based groups where, again, they're gaining skills and competencies that could be elevated for credentials. However, again, we know that very few of them actually are on a lucky path. You can see the stars at the bottom of that funnel as we try to look at the 90 million adults who are trying to move from the one end of the funnel down to the bottom where they're recognized for what they know and can do. There's not really a strategy. We know very few make it through this system. However, we also know there's no incentives to fix this. Right now, learning actors are operating separately from each other. We know that in the few cases where people are connecting learning from these other spaces into degree programs, probably some of you on this phone call, that you're doing it for particular programs, but this work hasn't scaled for every learner entering your institution. We also know that those who are facilitating learning outside of higher education are not able to connect with institutions of higher education very effectively. So what we believe very firmly is that the system must be transformed. Luck is not a strategy, and we must move from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, where we have a new envisioned future where all learning can count, and that millions of adults who have learning and are earning learning or gaining learning outside of higher education can have that recognized towards their credentials. We believe this can happen and have seen some of you do this work by focusing on competencies. When competency is the currency of the system, meaning competencies are what learners know and can do, that unites across all the systems, that we don't all have to work in credits in order to be able to move this forward, but if we're able to focus on competencies, we can combine learning from wherever it occurs. We also have to change the culture of all of our post-secondary level providers. We really have to understand that we have to value learning wherever it is, and regardless of how it is gained, if a person can demonstrate that competency, we should count it. We also know that we need to mobilize all sectors, and that we are never going to meet the scope and scale of this problem. Again, 90 million adults who need us to all work together. Colleges and universities, employers, military, and workforce training providers must mobilize towards finding solutions and recognizing learning wherever it occurs. Back to Haley.
Thank you, Amber. And so we are very excited to release this request for information. Our first priority in working this as a request for information is to gain a better understanding of what's happening in the field. We know that many of you on the phone and others are doing innovative and exceptional programs, and we know that there are models that recognize non-institutional learning toward credentials. But we don't have a sense of how these models are working, growing, and reaching scale. We want to build our future investments and strategies on the best foundations, and we think that those foundations are being built by you and in the field. We want to elevate solid practices. While the practice of prior learning assessment or recognition of learning isn't new, there is still a lot of mystery surrounding it. The sheer variety in approaches and objectives tells us that we have a lot to learn. And we also want to ultimately support efforts for scale. So we're looking for efforts, models, and programs that are ready to reach new populations. More so, we are seeking responses to this RFI from a variety of providers, including colleges and universities and state systems of higher education. We're very interested in engaging workforce training providers, namely community-based organizations that are often providing or facilitating access to industry-recognized certifications and other high-quality learning experiences. We're interested in working with employers, many of whom are building exceptional education and training programs that result in post-secondary level learning. We want to work with military programs that connect reentering veterans with further education opportunities that value and recognize the learning they did in service to our country. And we are interested in the variety of partnerships and consortia that are leveraging the work of all of these providers, including partnerships between employers and colleges, state system level efforts to recognize industry credentials, efforts to smooth pathways between military separation and credential attainment, and we're especially eager to understand how, by working together, we can accomplish more on behalf of learners. So we are especially interested in understanding how providers are thinking about quality. How are you building your programs and efforts using competency as currency and using learning outcomes as stated objectives for your programs? And how are you validating that learners have truly acquired the competencies? Lumina is, as always, interested in understanding how models and programs can reach scale. That doesn't mean, of course, that efforts serving small numbers of learners now are not interesting to us, but we'll be compelled by hearing your thoughts on how you can grow the reach of your efforts within your institution, across your institutions and organizations, and to serve more learners. We are also, of course, interested in innovation. Are you doing something differently than others? Are you approaching the issue from a unique perspective? We would love to hear about practices that have the potential to open new doors. And as we mentioned, we're really interested in exploring how partnerships or efforts that bring together multiple providers can elevate and escalate recognition of learning. If you're part of a partnership already or on the brink of establishing one, we would love to hear about it. And finally, we have work happening across a variety of spaces that are related to recognition of learning or could be helped by integration with those practices. In the form that is posted online, we ask if your work might integrate across one of these 4 fields: work with incarcerated populations, reentering populations, translation of non-credit education to for credit, expansion of CBE, competency-based education, or changing the business model of higher education. If you have efforts underway that integrate or engage with these other factors, we would really like to know. And so, I'm going to turn it over to Chad to talk briefly about the timeline.
Thanks, Haley. Responses to the RFI are due back to the email address on your screen by noon Eastern Standard Time on January 14th. The form is located at that website that we referenced earlier, where all of this information will be held after this webinar is over with. We're going to spend the month between the 14th of January and February 20th combing through your responses, possibly following up and asking questions about those responses and framing up our next steps. We anticipate being able to invite respondents to move forward with a full proposal by the 20th of February. Invited respondents will have then until June 21st, 2019 to complete that full proposal. We anticipate bringing those folks together at a convening this spring that would be designed to help you complete your proposal, learn from each other, and learn from experts in the field. And then we hope to announce implementation grant recipients mid-summer. The important thing to remember about this process is that it's largely going to be driven by what we receive back from this request for information. What we learn from what's happening in the field with different discrete providers and within different partnerships or consortia and systems is going to inform almost every aspect of how we move through the process.
That's great. So we really hope to catalyze your best efforts and that we can meet you where you are. To further articulate the process that we'll go through, in understanding maybe you have not read the documents online, to be clear, Lumina is asking for this RFI to gain a better understanding of the field. As Chad mentioned, once we go through the request for information forms, what we receive back, we hope to be able to identify opportunities for folks to receive planning awards that would support their development of an implementation proposal. We hope ultimately to be able to fund those implementation proposals in 2019. So while our primary objective is seeking information from the field, we also hope to support it financially and otherwise. And so we had a couple of questions come through on the Q&A, and I'd encourage folks to send in any questions they might have in the Q&A portion of the webinar box there. Chad, you want to help us out?
Absolutely. The first question was a simple one, just asking if the webinar was going to be, and the slides would be available after the fact, and absolutely, as I mentioned earlier, all of these slides and a recording of this webinar will be available at the All Learning Counts website that I referenced earlier.
We also had a question about how are we counting certificates. Matt, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. So if you would like to reference the Stronger Nation report that Haley mentioned earlier, you'll notice that we have a national report, and then you can also go and take a peek at your state report. And so we have a particular methodology that we use for counting certificates at both the national level and then also at the state level. We use a firm that does that uses state-level data that are specific and unique to your state to determine which certificates are considered certificates of value within your state and within your region. And those are the certificates that we include in the calculation for the state-specific report. In the national report, we use data from the American Community Survey, and we just use the national sample. But the full methodology is included in the Stronger Nation report. And if you have any specific questions other than the general question that I just tried to answer, we can certainly put you in touch with our strategic impact team. I would just ask that you send an email to the information mailbox, Chad, and we can get you in touch with one of our colleagues on the strategic impact team.
Absolutely. Thanks, Danette. And as just a further point, the certificate data that we count is also a terminal credential. So as you know, many people have got a bachelor's degree and a certificate. What we are counting here is actually the actual attainment rate, so people who hold certificate-only credentials. We also put a measure of quality, small q quality, about work in field, as well as earnings in some of that certificate data. So we try to be as precise as possible and are looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
We had another question about what constitutes an adult learner in terms of age, and for our purposes, we're thinking about learners who are between 25 and 64 years old.
And also to add, though, I think we're also interested in understanding adult experiences, right? Lumina, as you know, has a time-limited goal 2025, and we know that many 18-year-olds right now will not be 25 by the year 2025. However, we know that many folks out there have very adult experiences, and that work you do to support learners who have other challenges, work, military experience, other forms of disadvantage or challenge beyond simply being not a traditional student. We want to understand efforts that work for them as well. We do think the vast majority of folks served by these efforts will be in that age band that Chad mentioned.
Thanks, Haley. We received another question asking if there would be access to the implementation phase without submitting an RFI. And while we haven't talked about that internally, I'm looking around. I don't believe that our process really does start with the RFI. We're trying to gather as much information as we can and move from that into an implementation phase down the line.
Yeah, thank you.
There was a question about asking us to talk more about the integration element under key considerations.
So our intent there is not to disqualify. I will go back to that so you can see the factors that we're looking at. We're really interested in understanding how the practice of recognition of non-institutional learning could be directed toward helping efforts that are either underway or that you might think about. So, for instance, the work with incarcerated populations. We know that in many places across the nation, college programs inside prisons have not been scaled. But we do know that many are actually providing certification level programs, CTE programs. How can your institution or your model or your partnership find opportunities to connect inside post-secondary, inside CTE programs in prison, for example, to connect learners with further educational opportunity and employment outside? Similarly, we do think that some efforts about translating non-credit education to for-credit education could very highly complement any kind of efforts to do recognition of non-institutional learning. And so these are just ways that we're trying to think about how we might integrate other things the foundation is interested in with your efforts. Now, if you don't have anything in particular in one of these fields, that's okay. You don't have to answer that question. But if you do, we would really be interested in learning more about it.
Great, thanks, Haley. The next question asks if city-level data would be allowed, noting that Stronger Nation actually goes down to the level of county-level data. And I certainly want to hear what my colleagues have to say, but I think that our filter is as wide open as it can be. If you have good data at the municipal or civic level that inform some of what you're doing and provide insight as to how effective it might be, I think we would very much welcome hearing what you're doing to generate and use that data.
Exactly. And I recognize your name, Francine. I appreciate your question. Yes, absolutely. And the question about data is one. The question about reach and implementation of programming is another. We're looking for opportunities to go deeply within communities, within institutions and partnerships, or even across states and regions. So the field is wide open, as Chad said.
I think that answer actually dovetails nicely into the next question, which asks, do you have to be doing the work already, or could it be work that you are planning on, or that is just sort of entered what the asker says is an idea phase?
Great question.
Yeah.
So we are very much interested in work that is already underway and that could be scaled, that could be amplified, or that could reach more learners with some additional support. But we want to get a sense of what's already happening out there, what great partnerships you've already established, how you have figured out how best to reach individuals in your community, how best to ensure that your students get the supports that they need to be successful. So I think that the answer is yes, that the work already has to be happening in one form or another.
Right. But that we are looking for to take that kernel of work and expand it. And so if there are ways that your innovation will complement your existing work, then that is actually tailor-made for what this work is. But we're not, as Danette mentioned, looking to start new programs.
That's great. The next question asks if there's a limitation on the number of submissions from an organization, using as an example that there may be a university system that may give one submission, but individual campuses may also submit. I don't want to speak for the group, but I feel like that would be permissible if there are unique sort of circumstances within different parts of that organization. However, I would also say that the integrative part of what we're trying to do here would sort of suggest that if you can show that those efforts are aligned, then that strengthens the request for information as well.
Exactly right. And what we would want to see, or conversely, what we would not want to see are, say, multiple applications from the same entity, or applications that implicate a part of the system without the implicated partner's knowledge. And so we're always going to be looking for opportunities to that reflect integration, that reflect sharing, that reflect work underway. But we will not discount or exclude efforts that if IU wants to submit one program for IUPUI and IB Tech, or the regional campuses and workforce training providers, that is okay. But we would want to see evidence of integration.
And I would add that multi-campus efforts, evidence of partnerships, as indicated, consortia will certainly be looked upon quite favorably. We do think that efforts that go beyond a single institution have the opportunity to reach more learners. And so we do encourage multi-institution and multi-campus engagement in this request for information.
Great. We have another question on pre-employment certificates. If those certificates come, say, between an educational experience and the first job, do those count as post-secondary, do those count as a certificate for Lumina purposes?
Amber, can you provide our definition of what a high-quality credential is considered?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. You heard Danette talk about credential of value, and the way that gets operationalized is understanding if the credential leads to further education and further employment. So if you look at that certificate or certification, and it leads to, again, an increase in a wage and has a further education pathway, whether that's in higher education or on up in the industry, then that is what would be counted, that we would count as a high-quality credential. And maybe that leans right into the next question about the workforce development. Do workshops from workforce development count as post-secondary education if it's not part of a certificate or academic program? I think this is a great question that gets at the heart of what we're asking you to think through, is when you look at that learning that happens in the workshop, are the competencies and skills that are being developed at the level of post-secondary learning? Would that count towards a course that you currently offer in some way? It just is not, it's happening outside of the academic program, although you want to count that in the academic program. So this is why competencies we find are really important, because you really have to get at what is the level of learning. And you don't just want to look at that by content area, you want to look at that in a much more sophisticated way around competency and how that is applied. So hopefully that answers those two questions there about what's a high quality credential. We would also use that of high quality learning, and you want to look at both of those things.
Absolutely. And to clarify on the first question about the pre-employment industry certificate, that may actually be, in other terms, a industry-recognized certification. Those are often third-party and test-based, assessment-based programs, and so those absolutely count. However, we're always looking for the opportunity to connect those certifications to further education and employment. Many of them do incorporate competencies, as Amber was talking about, that are reflective of post-secondary level learning. And so we're going to be looking for opportunities to support that connective tissue, knowing that the certification should never be the dead end because it is offered outside of the academy, typically.
We have one question that came in about prior learning assessment, asking if they're working on PLA, prior learning assessment already, can they qualify for the planning award in order to expand their efforts?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a great question. One of the things we are really actively looking for are system-level strategies that emphasize how the organization, the provider, is able to recognize validated learning from other sources, and not necessarily efforts that reassess the student for knowledge and learning that has already been validated by those other sources. So, for example, we would probably not be too interested in supporting efforts that, say, amplify a portfolio development program that has been in place for a long time, or that would be part of a set of tests, right? What we would be interested in are opportunities to expand how the institution or the organization uses competencies, uses that currency to understand what the student already knows and is able to do through that validated other source, and apply it toward further post-secondary learning. So, was that clear? Okay.
Another question about the age of the learner that we're concerned with. Somebody asked if 17 is considered an adult in your state, can we measure 17 to 64? Again, I think in the spirit of the response that Haley gave a few minutes ago, we're really interested in making sure that the learning experiences of folks who tend to be, past that high school age, employment, military, community-based learning, other kind of local education providers, that kind of learning gets pulled into a single stream of learning that can be put toward a quality post-secondary credential. And so the 17 or 18-year-old definition of adult is not as important as the types of experiences that you're stitching together to move towards that degree, or that credential.
Right. And to address the question that may be out in the field, we're very interested in thinking about how work-based learning can be applied toward further education. It's not going to be necessarily every employer that provides post-secondary level work-based learning, but many employers actually spend a great deal of money, as was referenced in the information document, on their learning and development programs, upskilling incumbent workers, providing access to further education. We'd be very interested in understanding how post-secondary providers, colleges and universities, workforce training institution organizations are partnering with the private sector to help learners meet their learning needs and help connect those opportunities to further education. So I do hope that many of you will consider that branch as well. So it looks like we've come to the end of our questions. However, we encourage you to please do write in and send all of your questions to Lumina Adult Learner at luminafoundation.org. We will be monitoring that inbox closely, and we'll be pulling together a list of FAQs that we'll post online just as quickly as we can. I do anticipate we'll be able to turn this webinar recording around in about 48 hours. But please do check back and let us know if you've got questions, and we'll do that. So with that, I want to say thank you. I want to thank my colleagues, Amber, Nicole, Chad, and Zanette, for their time and contributions. We look forward to hearing from you in the future and look forward to seeing your responses. We're very eager to understand what you're doing and build upon the great foundations you've already laid. Thank you very much.